So, Professor Gillespie, sorry for keeping you waiting. Thank you for being there for us. And I believe that you're in talking in the US, so you really had to be awake for much longer than really we would have liked you to be. But we're very, very keen to hear about Okakura Tenshin and India, because I think this is really another connect in modern times that almost every Indian who's interested in Japan knows his connection with Vivekananda and with Tagore and with Shantiniketan. So just a little bit about Professor Gillespie, who is a PhD in comparative literature and culture from the Indiana University. He's the president of Gillespie Global Group, an intercultural research consulting and training company in New York City. His major publications include alternative Japanese drama, 10 plays with Robert Rolfe, 1992, and a bilingual handbook on Japanese culture with Sugiura Yoichi. In 2004, he has also edited the modern Japanese theater section in the Encyclopedia of Asian Theater, 2006. Over to you, Mr. Gillespie.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear.
Very clearly.
I want to thank the first three presentations, which are absolutely fascinating. And you're absolutely correct. It's in New York. I've been speaking to you from New York City, 2:45 a.m. But it's still quite vigorous, and it's rather cold outside, so this is okay. I don't have any photos on the slides I sent. It's just words, so I don't know if I think you may have passed it on to everybody there already, so I'm not going to try to put it on the screen. So my topic, Okakura Tenshin and India, mutual influences, I think fits right into what we've been discussing. And Okakura was already a known quantity toward the end of the 19th century, probably more well known in global circles in which he was known than even Tagore was in his circles. But nevertheless, at the end of the 19th century, what you have is at least two Asians, who were budding superstars, almost received like the rock stars are today, with thousands of people thronging to try to hear them. They had lectured all over the world, and they finally met in 1902. And I think it's probably interesting. I'll very briefly try to outline how did that happen? Why did that happen? And Okakura, who had been all over China and Japan and Europe and the United States, had not been to India yet. And so he finally did go to India. And the reason it happened was that he had one of his lectures in 1895-96 in Tokyo was heard by a wealthy American woman named Josephine McLeod. And Josephine McLeod was a wealthy person who had been a follower of Ramakrishna Vivekananda, a Swami in Bengal, and she had already met Tagore. And she was so taken with Tenshin, and by the way, Tenshin, nobody in Japan calls him Okakura Kakuzo. Everybody refers to him as Tenshin. And that's why I'm using that version of his name here. He got that name because some of his students, and they became famous themselves, Yokoyama Taikan may be the most famous of them, as students under the kind of a guru, and in which they looked at Tenshin as that kind of person. They called him Tenshin with the characters for heaven and heart, Tenshin. And that name stuck. Of course, those familiar with Japan know that many Japanese who get famous change the reading of their given name or take a different name, and they become known in public thereafter by that name. And that's what happened to Tenshin. So before he met Josephine McLeod, he had learned English. And in his day, he was very, very rare. In fact, even in today's Japan, he's very, very rare. Without leaving Japan, he learned English to the extent of a native speaker of English. His father was rather shrewd in business and lived in Yokohama. And in those days, middle of the 19th century, the place was teeming with foreigners. And his father realized that if you're going to get anywhere in the world, you had to know English. So from about the age of 9, Tenshin was learning English, and almost to the detriment of his Japanese. And many of the Japanese observers who studied him, including one of his biographers, said he knew English better than Japanese. And if you look at his writings, all of them are in English. And some of them were never even put into Japanese until after Tenshin had died. So he had a reputation, and I think of all of his he was very charming in lecturing. He was very, very smart. He got into Tokyo University at 15, age of 15, but his ability in English is probably the key reason why he had so many important contacts with wealthy people in the US and in Europe. And it's what got him into China and ultimately to India. What kind of a world did he grow up in? This is important in the background based on some of the things he came up with in his own sort of philosophy of his life. But he and Tagore had in common that Asians were looked at as inherently inferior by most of the so-called white world in those days, so North America and Western Europe. And at that time, after Japan had been opened up from 2.5 centuries or so of isolation, the attitude that Westerners had toward Japan, not just Japan, but China, and the kinds of things they could buy from Asia and so on, the bric-a-brac and so on, they might have been fine, but they were looked at as kind of, not that important. And those cultures were, of course, inferior to Western cultures. And so as many Western countries began to visit East Asia and South Asia, they pretty soon began to kind of colonize places. And as everybody knows, India was already a colony of Great Britain, and all the Western countries, even tiny ones, were in China carving it up, saying, "This is my sphere of influence. You stay out." And so gradually, after the opening of Japan, many of the Western countries, certainly the United States and Europe, were involved in this, were kind of foisting on Japan these treaties that were inherently unequal. They're just simply unequal. They were for the good of these other countries and not for Japan. And there's so many examples. I'm not going to go into them, but many of you already are fully aware of that fact anyway. So this is an important fact in the context in which these two famous Asians grew up and came of age. Things began to change toward the end of the 19th century for two reasons. One is because many of the people who appraised art began to realize, what these folks are making in Japan and in China and in India are really good. And they stand comparison with our best. Now, that wasn't an overwhelming wave at the time, but it became gradually something that many people in the West began to realize. These countries make just as good stuff in art as we do, and maybe even better. And the other reason is because of battlefield conquests. And Japan won two major northern skirmishes at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. They were both fought over the control of the Korean Peninsula. The first, the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 and 5. Japan won it. And the second one, again, over Korea, was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 and 5, and Japan won that one. So this was a bit of an eye-opener. And Japan made a serious statement about, who they were and who they wanted to be. But many Western countries, even after these victories, still regarded East Asian countries, especially Japan, as something like a kind of an unruly newcomer. Hadn't learned its position in the world where it should be, on the so-called totem pole. And so I think Tagore and Tenshin both chafed at this absolutely openly biased and unequal kind of treatment that they had. And it led to how they looked at life and how they dealt with life. And how they dealt with life was very, very different. By the way, I should add at this point that Kakuzo, his father was a businessman, and Kakuzo means something like the corner warehouse. And by the time he got into college at the University of Tokyo, he began to feel that was really a mundane name. So he changed the kanji with the same pronunciation, Kakuzo, kind of the awakened one, or in today's parlance, woke, And so he still was called Kakuzo, but he changed the kanji for his name to apparently get better acceptance, I think. And he graduated from Tokyo University. He wasn't even 20 years old yet, and he immediately started working in arts administration in the Japanese government. He had several positions. He was the head of the Tokyo Bijutsu Gakko, the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. 1990, he was there for about 8 years. Then the Imperial Household Museum, 1892, was the forerunner of Tokyo National Museum. He was the head of that. But he was forced to resign, or he himself resigned from all of those positions. And there were a few others, partly because he was a lackluster administrator. I think he was too smart, and he didn't have the patience to put up with people who couldn't follow him. So he also had an unfortunate, for his career anyway, a sexual liaison with the wife of the Japanese ambassador, Baron Kuki, was his name. And Kuki, his wife, was a former geisha who just couldn't adjust to the life in Washington. And so Kuki knew Tenshin quite well and asked Tenshin on one of his trips back to Japan to take his wife back to Japan. And of course, these trips took several weeks, and he had a torrid affair with this woman. And when she got back, she had a baby. And there's still an argument today about whether that was his baby or the ambassador's baby. And but that son turned out to be an extremely famous philosopher, and many of us in Japanese studies have read him. His name was Kuki Shuzo, and he wrote Iki no Kozo, which is a word that means something like, cool or chic or something. And it's just an important concept in the Japanese aesthetics and philosophy. So that affair in Japan was completely open to everybody knew what was going on. And so he was kind of becoming persona non grata in certain circles. And so he jumped at the chance when Josephine MacLeod invited him and engineered his trip to India in 1901. And he finally got to India in early January 1902. And this is, and the very day he arrived, she introduced him to Vivekananda and to Tagore. And Tagore even invited Tenshin to live in his home for the duration of his stay there. And this was a comfortable thing for Tenshin, and he wrote his first book there. He drafted it, and this is Ideals of the East. All of these books are in print. You can get them if you are interested. He's a fairly good writer, and in Tagore's home, he met a couple of people who were pretty instrumental in the rest of his stay in India. One was a woman, an American woman named Margaret Elizabeth Noble, who was known as Sister Nivedita, Nivedita, and she had been she was an Irish, she was an ardent nationalist from Ireland, and totally opposed to the Brits, and she joined the Swadeshi movement, which was really brewing at that time for the independence of Bengal. And she wanted to get the Brits out of India and everything. And she was like a completely ideal Hindu woman. And Tenshin called her his vision of the Hindu woman incarnate, kind of the mother of all people, the mother of India. And I think Tenshin was pretty partial in the Japanese amae sense of having a parent fawn on him. And he never had a mother who did that. And so his mother had died when he was just a youngster. And he fell in love in a way with women who were motherly. And so Nivedita was one such woman. And of course, her native language was English. And she edited everything he wrote in English while they knew each other. And she edited his book, The Ideals of the East, and wrote the introduction to it. And so without her, I'm not sure he would have had such a successful stay in India. And the other person he met there beyond Tagore was a Tagore nephew, Surendanath. He was about 10 years younger than Tenshin, and they got along well. They exchanged ideas. They talked every day. They traveled together and went to see art in India. And these were two of his very most important relationships while he was there. And I should just mention briefly the other people while he met, who were the so-called Boston Brahmins. There were three others. One was John Lafarge, a painter, who at first was very skeptical about Japanese art. He wondered aloud. He wrote an essay in 1869 saying something about, do the Japanese even have an ideal? And but he gradually changed his mind, because he was living in Newport, Rhode Island, and this was a bevy of stuff from Japan coming in through that point. Even Commodore Matthew C. Perry and his family lived in Newport, Rhode Island, and so he got a real dose of Japanese art, and it infused his own painting career and gave it new life. And he told Isabella Stewart Gardner, another super wealthy, perhaps the wealthiest of all of the Boston Brahmins, who really admired Tenshin. Lafarge told her, he said, Tenshin was the most intelligent critic of art, and I might also say of everything that I know of. A pretty blanket piece of praise, I think. But and also William Sturgis Bigelow, who knew of Tenshin's problems in Japan, can't hold a job and so on, and that he financed various trips for Tenshin and introduced him around and got him into the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and eventually helped him get the position of director of the Department of Chinese and Japanese Art. And many of the recommendations that Tenshin made for purchase of art objects from Asia, William Bigelow bought. So this is what happened, sort of how he got to India and what he made of his career there. Now he did meet one other person, and I mention this because it was a real love affair. He met a woman named Priyambara Devi Banerjee, who was 9 years younger than he was. And She was a distant cousin of Tagore and was around the house a lot, and they struck up a friendship. I think she happened to be quite attractive. Tenshin was just attracted to her, like he was to a lot of women. But in her case, they exchanged a lot of letters, and the letters were all in an exhibition, which I happened to see in Tokyo in about 2006 or 7 or somewhere in there, at a museum, a small museum. And I lingered over every letter that she wrote him and he wrote her. They were all there. They're all in print, and they're all part of the work of Tenshin's collected works in English, all available. But he used phrases like in letters to her, like a longing for the jade flower, the ambrosia of the Taoists. And she used phrases to him like the beauty of longing and unsatisfied longing and the heart longing for the intimate sky and so on. There is a controversy, is still unknown exactly, whether they ever consummated their love affair. But I hardly think it matters. If you read these letters, you get lost in them. They're just fascinating. Now, what about their ideas? And that's the last thing here, and I'll close with just a few of these things. There's 2 or 3 big ideas. One of them is Asia is one, which is the first sentence of the book Ideals of the East. Now, you know, what does that mean? You know, Asia is one. Most Asians don't consider themselves Asian in the first place anyway. Certainly Tagore didn't. And Tagore actually credits one of the things he got from an influence from Tenshin was the idea of Asia, of what it was. And Tenshin was really had the chip on his shoulder of those unequal treaties and how the West had been so biased so long against the East. And he said Asia is one because he wanted it to tie up the fact that in his view, while Western art was at a low ebb, and while Western countries had really very little in common with each other, they're also individualistic and vying for prominence with each other and so on, and going to war and this and that, that Asia, despite all of its huge areas and vastly different cultures and languages, he found that far more harmonious than the West. And that's what he meant by Asia is one. And so the rest of the book is a little bit of a kind of his attempt to prove his theory that Asia is more homogeneous than Europe. And what's interesting to me is that he's wrote this stuff in English, and he used very ironclad sort of American style, British style logic to get his point across. And maybe that's one reason why these works took a long time before they were ever translated into Japanese. And it was kind of a Hegelian logic where the respect for art was such that that the Asians had for each other, that you have a kind of reverse Hegelian argument. And I'll just oversimplify it greatly by saying, on the one hand, you had, let's say, India, and on the other hand, so that would be the thesis, and the antithesis would be China, and the synthesis was Japan. Now, right off the bat, immediately, some people might not take umbrage with that, but you have to sort of read between the lines in Ideals of the East to find out what Tenshin actually meant. What he meant by that was, yeah, Asia's more harmonious, but among all these equals in Asia, Japan was the top. And he felt that all the strains of European art and whatever you might find in Western art, you can find through its development in Japan and India, in China and India, and then it comes to fruition in Japan. and that Japan then becomes the prominent sort of number one, the first among equals in Asia. And part of what he was trying to do here, and here's another thing he took from Tagore and from Vivekananda, and that's the concept of Advaitism. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly, but Advaita is a concept of non-dualism. So these things were not so different in Asia in this non-dualistic argument that they actually could come together and meld and have some kind of harmony. And this was his theory, and much of what he did after Ideals of the East was meant to shore up that notion. And and one of his other concepts is what's Japan? And Japan he looks at as an art object. In effect, he has a political point here, and an Italian scholar, Michele Mara, says art exists for Tenshin as a discursive, and its true nature is political. And it's hard to avoid that conclusion when you're looking at Tenshin's writings. He says Japan is a museum of Asiatic civilization. Its singular genius leads it to dwell on all phases of the ideals of the past and to bring them together in living Advaitism. So this is a bit of a stretch here. I think people who read Tenshin will marvel at his turn of phrase. But when you figure out what he's saying, you might not want to at least 100% agree with it. And he said this kind of thing of the old traditions that Japan maintains, he used the word, I think, tenacity, the tenacity that keeps Japan true to its Asiatic soul, even while it raises her to the rank of a modern power. He said it's like we still hold to the Shintoism with the ancestor worship and so on. And he was not wanting to sweep away everything in favor of something modern. He thought, yeah, we can absorb something modern, but let's add it bit by bit to what we already have. And we can't see something can't stay the same forever. So things will change. It's a modern world, so let's change. And he was really put out with Tagore, in that Tagore had no notion of wanting to modernize at all in terms of using the new manufactured products and so on like that. And they didn't have a falling out over it. They just had a real difference of opinion on that. And the third thing, and I think this is no, I see what time it is. It's 1:41 in your city, New Delhi. He was nationalism, and this nationalistic view of Tenshin, he really put together in almost a bit of a screed called The Awakening of Japan. And now this was never translated until 1939, so long after, or 38, about 25 years after Tenshin had died. And one of the reasons is it was so livid, it was so angry at the world in a way that he said that he was justifying Japan's going and taking over Korea. And then when Tenshin and Tagore talked about this, Tagore eschewed nationalism of any kind. We cannot have nationalism. Maybe if Tagore was a nationalist of any kind, he was a Bengali nationalist, and with the Swadeshi movement, which was, a movement for the freedom and liberty of Bengal. And but he eschewed nationalism of other countries being nationalist, and even Nivedita, who had edited Ideals of the East, had a falling out. It was such a disagreement with Tenshin that they had a falling out, and they split. And that's one reason why people think that the English for The Awakening of Japan is just a little, I don't know, it's off. It's not. It doesn't look as if she edited it, and I think she refused. There's no hard evidence about that, but I think she refused about that because she was an ardent Irish nationalist. She didn't think that what Tenshin wanted in Korea, and then the taking of Manchuria in the 30s. So I'll tell you this fact. Tagore went to Japan the first time in 1916, and he was on his way to the US for medical treatment of some kind. And he was so famous in Japan by then, in part because of Tenshin living in his home and so on, that something of 50,000 people, I think, I can't remember the exact number, but some 50,000 people came to Tokyo Station to greet him when he arrived there. But he gave a famous speech in Japan, which a lot of people got in to hear, and one of their big auditoriums back then. And he spoke adamantly against nationalism, and he never once mentioned the name of Tenshin. Some people have figured out maybe he meant that Tenshin, but he never mentioned his name. He was too, I don't know, nice a man or something. He didn't want any kind of argument. He always referred to Tenshin as his good friend or my intimate friend. And then he came back to Japan in 1917 on his way back to India. Only 2 people came to greet him because speech against nationalism so turned off the Japanese that he became almost persona non grata Japan just within a few months' time. This is see if I got another special note here to you. Well, in terms of his best work is Book of Tea, and when he went to the Book of Tea, he began to modulate his sharp edges of his ardent nationalism. And I just want to read 2 brief passages of Tea. They're very short. Unfortunately, he writes, the Western attitude is unfavorable to the understanding of the East. The Christian missionary goes to impart, but not to receive. Your information is based on the meager translations of our immense literature, if not on the unreliable anecdotes of passing travelers. And he follows that up with, what dire consequences to humanity lie in the contemptuous ignoring of Eastern problems? European imperialism, which does not disdain to raise the absurd cry of the yellow peril, fails to realize that Asia may also awaken to the cruel sense of the white disaster. Pretty telling words there. And then, but you can really see the nature of the Book of Tea is far more gentle when he says, is the first one.
Gillespie, I think we have to, I think there are a few people waiting for lunch here because it's almost lunch.
I know. You put it, and I'm waiting to go to sleep too, but I understand. This is the last thing. He said this, Teaism is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence. It inculcates purity and harmony, the mystery of mutual charity, the romanticism of the social order. It is essentially a worship of the imperfect, as it is a tender attempt to accomplish something possible in this impossible thing we know as life. So he had his soft side, and he and Tagore bemoaned in common the fact that Western education simply took the spirit, the spiritual, the emotion out of their teaching, whereas in their teachings in India and in Japan, it was still there and very important, that kind of thing. And if those of, I mentioned, I think 4 books for further reading. I don't know if you can see this. This will come out on your screen.
Not
this is the
really. No, I think we'd read it out, read the names out. I think we can't see it very clearly.
This book is by a citizen of India, Rustam Bharucha, and he's not a Japan scholar, but I found his book fascinating and extremely well researched. It's called Another Asia, Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura Tenshin. there's a lot more in there than I've been able to present. And I'm sorry about the hodgepodge of the presentation, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to field them.
No, it was absolutely a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much, Mr. Gillespie. I mean, you know, I think he was an extraordinary personality, as was Tagore. And they were also products of their times. But, you know, when you spoke about Asia and one, you know, one just realized that this kind of, you know, the pan-Asianism that followed in Japan, and that was in that, you know, that period just before the Second World War. So you can see the emotions that were building up and the sentiments that were building up in Japan. I think he reflected that. Any questions? Any questions among the audience? Yes. So thank you so much, because we have another session in the afternoon, but it's been really quite fascinating. And I think the books that you mentioned, certainly there'll be a lot of people here who'd be interested to look at those books. So thank you again. Thank you for staying awake, for your patience, and you know, really wonderful presentation.